Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Clinton Presidential Center. I'm Stephanie Street, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Clinton Foundation. Thank you all for joining us for this discussion of the Clinton-Gore campaign and the emergence of a Democratic agenda for the 21st century. Tonight, our esteemed panel is going to take us back to 1991 and the political climate that gave rise to Bill Clinton's eventual victory in the 1992 presidential election. This evening, our moderator is renowned author and columnist Ron Brownstein. Currently, Ron is National Journal Group's editorial director. Not only is he responsible for coordinating political coverage and activities across Atlantic media publications, but he is also a regular contributor to both National Journal and The Atlantic. Previously, Ron was the national affairs columnist and national political correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, in addition to writing a weekly Washington Outlook column. He is the recipient of several journalism awards, the author of 6 books, and he regularly appears on national television. Please join me in welcoming Ron Brownstein.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you all for coming. I guess I should start by thanking President Clinton and the Clinton Foundation, and I think I speak for the entire panel here when I say I want to thank you for recognizing that in this age of 24-hour cable and the internet and talk radio, that one of our great national challenges is a shortage of opportunities for political pundits to have their views heard. So I want to thank you for taking a small step toward rectifying that. As Democrats began the process of selecting their presidential nominee in 1992, the party had lost the capacity to effectively compete for the presidency. Republicans had won 5 of the 6 previous presidential elections, 3 of them by landslide margins. Over those 6 elections, from 1968 to 1988, Democrats had won, on average, only 43% of the popular vote. The situation in the Electoral College was even worse. Over those 6 elections, Republicans had won, on average, 417 Electoral College votes. And one of my favorite statistics is that during the 3 elections of the 1980s, the Democrats had won a smaller share of the available Electoral College votes than in any 3 consecutive election sequence since the formation of the modern party system in 1828. It was not an exaggeration when commentators and strategists talked about a Republican lock on the Electoral College. So when then-Governor Clinton stood in front of the old State House, that was literally the backdrop for his presidential announcement in October 1991. But I always thought that the real backdrop was that legacy of failure and even marginalization. Bill Clinton's goals as a candidate were sweeping: to modernize the Democratic agenda in a manner that could both advance traditional goals through new means and also rebuild an electoral majority for activist government. To assess how candidate Clinton formulated that vision and how well he implemented it, we have an extraordinary panel of strategists and thinkers who are at the center of his national political career, both as candidate and president. Pretty much anybody in this room could have been on this panel, so we've had to narrow it down to our kind of magnificent 6. Don Baer was communications director in the White House and is now vice chairman and chief strategy officer for Burson Marsteller. James Carville was the campaign manager for the 1992 campaign, star of the War Room, and is now, and here I quote, an author, actor, producer, talk show host, speaker, and restaurateur. Not clear what he's doing in his spare time. Al Fromm was the founder of the Democratic Leadership Council, formed in 1985 to rethink the Democratic agenda and political strategy. He's now the principal of the Fromm Company. Frank Greer, the founding partner of GMMB, was the media consultant for President Clinton's 1992 campaign and has now escaped D.C. for the other Washington in Seattle. Vernon Jordan, the former president and chief executive officer of the National Urban League, chaired the presidential transition in 1992 and is now the senior managing director of Lazard Frere, the senior counsel to Aiken Gump, and the author of an extremely engaging memoir that I once had the privilege to explore with him in all places and public television in Kentucky. And then finally, we have the hometown favorite, Lottie Shackleford, the former mayor of Little Rock, former deputy campaign manager for the 1992 Clinton campaign, and former vice chair of the Democratic National Committee. Welcome, all. Al, let me begin with you, because one strand of this story does start with the DLC. As I mentioned, in the 1980s, Democrats had hit a low ebb, and there were competing theories about how the party might revive. Some thought it was possible to resurrect the New Deal coalition with a populist message about economic fairness. There was a competing neoliberal camp that offered more centrism on economic issues and trade, but conventionally liberal positions on foreign policy and social issues. And then there was the New Democratic effort centered on the DLC. How did that differ from the other competing traditions in its prescription for the party, and how did it shape what Bill Clinton ran on in 1992?
Well, first of all, Ron, thank everybody for coming, and President Clinton, thank you for hosting this great reunion. When we looked at the statistics that you cited about the previous presidential elections, and looked at a map. If you look at a map, there was only one state that out of the previous 5 elections, the Democrats had won 4 times. And I think there were 3 or 4 others that they had split 3-2, and everyone else had gone at least 4 times for the Republicans. We basically decided that we had to talk to the people who go to work every day and play by the rules. We call it the forgotten middle class. And we thought the traditional progressive democratic principles, but furthered with new ideas, modern ways, would be the way that you could actually get people to start voting for us again. But a key element of that was that people wouldn't even listen to us. And we had to show that we were different. We were different very quickly in 5 ways. One, we promoted economic growth and not just redistribution. Secondly, we grounded our policies in mainstream values like work, family, responsibility. Third, we had a new ethic which said it wasn't just, as a lot of people perceived the Democrats, something for nothing, or as the Republicans, every man for himself. It was this concept of opportunity and responsibility going together. It was a concept of reciprocity. You got something from your country, but you also had a responsibility to give something back. Fourth, we tried to get beyond the isolationist image of the Democratic Party with a sort of the reconnecting with the Roosevelt, Truman, Wilson progressive internationalism. And finally, we believed in an activist government, but then one that didn't have to be bureaucratic, and it served people as customers. So we just tried to redefine the message. And ideas like welfare reform and national service were evidence that we were different than the Democrats they'd been voting against.
Lottie Shackleford, President Clinton certainly adopted arguments and policy ideas from the DLC model that Al talked about, but he went beyond them too in certain ways, and the way he talked about the economy, the way he talked about middle-class families. I'm interested in your view. How did the experience in Arkansas shape his message and agenda in 1992?
Well, I think in many ways it probably was evolutionary from the time most Arkansans first started to hear about a Bill Clinton. From the time he first ran for office, he was always talking about the potential and what we needed to do as Arkansans at that time to be better and to truly have an opportunity to experience your greatest potential. Fast forward on to that, to the 91 for the 92 campaign, it was the same kind of message. I think all of us, you got the sense that government has a responsibility, but you too have a responsibility. And I think that was one of the real changes, so to speak, that we started to see in that campaign. It was the beginning of somebody saying, I'm here to work with you. You think about, you know, the book he put out, putting people first. And these kinds of things, those things resonated with folk. And it's like everything else, talking about giving you hope and making you feel that you truly can make a difference and you didn't have to be ashamed of your government nor yourselves. You know, so I think that was the beginning.
Vernon, I want to ask you about another aspect of the backdrop, because there was certainly an element of tough love toward the party, toward his own party, in the message in 91 and 92, maybe more amplified at other points than others. But certainly in one seminal moment in the campaign, a DLC speech in Cleveland in 1991, he said, quote, "Too many of the people that used to vote for us have not trusted us in national elections to defend our national interests abroad, to put their values into our social policy at home, or to take their tax money and to spend it with discipline." Pretty tough words about your own party. I'm interested in your thought about why was the party ready for, enough in the party ready for that message by 1992 for him to be able to win the nomination, even while offering a pretty stern critique of where the party had been over the past decade or so?
Well, you know, the party was lost at sea. The party didn't have much leadership, and Bill Clinton came in 1991, and he was to the Democratic Party what Rosa Parks was to the Civil Rights Movement. He was to the Democratic Party what the students at A&T February 1st, 1960 were to the Civil Rights Movement. He was to the Democratic Party what Martin Luther King became to the movement. It was change, it was different, it was fresh, it was young. It was also experienced. He'd been governor a long time. And it was Renaissance time in the Democratic Party. And a lot of the older Democrats had to be brought around. They had to be converted. They had to be convinced. And here we are, celebrating 20 years.
Frank, you know, by the time you get to the announcement speech in 91, it's a place where you would have to kind of synthesize new and old. And if you read that speech today, there are certainly a lot of notes that would be familiar and traditional to Democrats about expanding opportunity and economic fairness. But there are also, you know, kind of some new notes about, as Al said, reciprocal responsibility and marrying opportunity and responsibility. Can you talk a little bit about the process of that speech, that kind of a landmark moment in the campaign, and to what extent there was a pull or tug about how far you went in the traditional direction versus how far you went in the kind of challenging the party direction?
I think one of the things that in that period of time you need to remember is that Bill Clinton had been on the front lines for 10 years. In education reform, in welfare reform, he had been on the front lines doing the hard work in a tough state, by the way. So that he had a better kind of understanding of how to communicate this new approach for Democrats and how to communicate opportunity, but also responsibility and a sense of community that we needed to restore to the country. So I think it was based on his terrific experience in Arkansas, his personal values, and what he brought to the campaign. And the other thing which was very different for Democrats, he was a hell of a good communicator. So he had a message, he understood the issues, he had the experience, as Vernon said, but he also had an ability to communicate it. And the speech and the reaction that he had at the DLC, that was the first kind of trial run of the message, was phenomenal. I mean, it was an amazing speech and and it's relevant today. I said this to the president just a minute ago. And the speech he gave on this old State House lawn in '91 is as relevant today in terms of the issues, the approach for Democrats, and the approach for the country, as it was then.
James, James, we're going to talk in a few minutes about the general election and some of the innovations you guys pursue, but I want to ask you about the primary for a minute, if I could, because it was very different, I think, than what you or certainly most people expected. And most people were kind of gearing up for this ideological, generational battle with Mario Cuomo, perhaps, representing the old New Deal consensus, and Clinton running as the centrist, new generation, new Democrat. Instead, your main rival turned out to be Paul Tsongas, who kind of came out of that neoliberal strain from Gary Hart and others, Michael Dukakis, who ran at President Clinton mostly from the center in many ways. How much did that scramble your calculations and change your approach to the way he presented himself to the electorate?
Well, I mean, first of all, I got to go back is we had some events right before the New Hampshire primary that's kind of scrambled the approach probably more than Paul Tsongas did.
Yeah, those are two.
Yeah. One of the things that, and I think anybody who's worked a presidential campaign, everybody talks about the general. The general's actually kind of easy. You got airplanes and staff, and you got federal funds, and you got all of that stuff, and you kind of stay in one place, and you sleep in the same bed every night. And you got all this. The primary, you're just always going. I mean, we go in like Harry Thomason's airplane, which was not like a 727 anything, you know, would be sitting in there packed, going to New Hampshire, which was like a 4-hour flight. You'd freeze and go. And you'd have staff meetings at like 2 o'clock in the morning. In a thing that
was lunchtime.
Struck me was just the unbelievable fatigue. The other thing is, you just don't, sounds like no idea of like the things that President Clinton could do in a campaign. If it was Arsenio Hall, you just knew he could do it. If it was a town hall, you knew he could do it. If it was meet the press, you knew he could do it. I mean, it just very seldom does a campaign just come up with things and you have the confidence that it's going to be okay. You know, I mean, it's just going to sort of do it. And so we were
even the week before New Hampshire?
Huh?
Even the week before New Hampshire?
I've never seen, if you look at the polling and Sandra
certainly the hours you put in.
If you look at the polling the week before New Hampshire, I have never seen a human being in my life perform to the standard that he performed from the Monday, that final 8 days. I'll never forget that town hall in Keene, New Hampshire. It was just and it was one after another after another. And that was the only way. And by the way, even that night, we actually lost New Hampshire. Right. Unbeknownst to, there's a sign out there, President Clinton is phoning Chelsea with the good news of New Hampshire win. We lost the damn thing by 7 points.
Yeah, he got 19% of the vote.
Right.
Yeah, right.
But, you know, it was so funny. But we actually ended up in New Orleans after all of that, and I had to do that was the Red Shirt Today show, and I just couldn't go no more. I just literally, like, collapsed. And that's the thing about primaries that people don't understand. They're so much harder than generals. They really are. And they're so much more, like, intense. You just, like, hate everybody and just want to, you know. I hate them. You know, and, remember Rahm's tirade against, who was the fundraiser from Baltimore? We're going to take a fork and stick it through his heart, you know. And, I can't remember the guy's name.
I will bring you Don in a second. Vernon?
There is something that we should never forget about the New Hampshire defeat, and that is that they came in late that night, and nobody was talking, everybody was quiet. You may remember this, James. And somebody asked the question, Governor, what do we do now? And the governor said, take me to the people. That was his response the night of the defeat in New Hampshire. He said, take me to the people. He didn't say call the Times or the Journal or the Washington Post or the networks. He said, take me to the people, because he understood where democracy ultimately resides. And it's not in the editorial pages of the Post and the Times and the Wall Street Journal. It was to the people. And then he went to Georgia, and he won, and the rest is history.
And the state started to fall down.
Yeah.
Frank?
One of the things I was going to go back to remind folks is that we went into New Hampshire with a lot of good research from Stan Greenberg. We took Bill Clinton's message and his experience and what he believed in and the new approach, opportunity, responsibility, community, and we took it into focus groups in New Hampshire. This is actually before the announcement speech. And Democrats in those focus groups said, thank goodness, this is what we've been looking for, waiting for. We really respond. I mean, the response was amazing. And then, to go to your point, people forget that the first spot of the campaign was a 60-second spot. People said, candidates can't do this. To camera, Bill Clinton talking about his message and his plan for America. And we went from 15% in the polls in 10 days to 35%. And it was from 35% that we had a few problems and we came back down. But thank God, given the message and the research that we had done, and Greenberg did a fantastic job on that, we had a message from the announcement speech all the way through New Hampshire that was so welcomed by Democrats. It was new responsibility, it was welfare reform, it was cops on the street.
Well, let me bring in Don, because, I mean, that positive response in the focus group was one thing, but it was not, the idea of linking opportunity and responsibility and the way he talked about responsibility and welfare was not, and crime and all of those things, was not uniformly cheered, especially at the outset. I mean, in 1991, at the speech at Cleveland, I mean, Jesse Jackson was essentially leading a counter-protest. There was a point early in the campaign where Doug Wilder was quoted as suggesting that Bill Clinton only started talking about welfare after David Duke did so well in Louisiana in 1991. So, I mean, he became enormously, he always talked about racial reconciliation, became enormously popular with African-American voters, but this was somewhat fraught terrain at the beginning. It wasn't like it was welcomed by everyone in the party.
Right, well, and I saw it all from the perspective, as you did as a journalist at the time. So I was an editor and reporter at something we used to call in this country a national news magazine, at that time U.S. News and World Report, which we also called U.S. News and World Report. I was covering part of the campaign. In fact, my kids like to tease me. I'm getting old enough where I'm always saying, you know, it was exactly 17 years ago right now that this happened. Well, here's the deal. It was exactly 20 years ago today. Sounds like the Beatles. 20 years ago today that I closed the first article that I ever wrote about Bill Clinton. And it was to go into the magazine the week that he was announcing his candidacy down here. And I got to spend an extended period of time with him on a flight from Washington to Memphis, because you couldn't fly direct to Little Rock at the time. You pretty much can't now, unfortunately. But for a brief period there,
are enduring,
right? Yeah, and I don't know if he remembers it. We hit bad weather around Memphis, and we couldn't land. So I got to spend 3 hours with him in the air instead of the 1.5 hours that we were going to get. And I do remember this, that the governor was meeting Mrs. Clinton in Memphis, where they were going to be flying back to Little Rock because Chelsea was 11 years old and she was going to one of her first boy-girl dances, and they wanted to get home in time to get you off to that. So, but we got to spend an extended period of time, and there were two things that, to me as a journalist, came through then that were very different. And I had covered the 1988 presidential campaign. In fact, they put me on every Democratic candidate who lost. Every time I would come on the plane, about 2 months later, that candidate would be out of the race.
Yeah.
Not because of me, I don't know. And in fact, my reward for those sins was they then sent me to cover the Bush White House as a White House correspondent. But what I noticed was, and I still have the transcript, Mr. President, and I actually still have your ticket for your seat, which if you want it back for refund purposes or whatever, I can give it to you.
Expense.
But there were two things that came through loud and clear, and actually the way the media covered that campaign and covered him in that campaign, I think, sort of bore this out. One was that it all started with ideas. And as general and vague as that may sound, that was unusual. And we had not really had the ideas behind policy, things that had come out of the work with the DLC and certainly out of the work here in Arkansas that was core to that. But the second, which relates to your point, Ron, is this. It also came out of this personal narrative and the story of his life here in Arkansas that went all the way back to Hope, that Mandy and all of the rest of you mined so well later on. But it was so clear that this was a person who was genuinely, not artificially, not in a manufactured way, connected to a place and to real people who, by the way, he cared deeply about, and as you probed and scratched, they cared deeply about him. And part of that was the African American community, where he had the, if you will, bona fides to be able to say these things about welfare and say these things about crime that most Democratic politicians from places you would have imagined could say these things were not in a position to do. And so it lent great credibility to it, and it wasn't seen as an attack. It was seen as how do we come together to solve these challenges together.
Al, let me ask you, and maybe Frank and James can jump in on this too, because to kind of continue the point Don raised. There was many memorable moments during the primary campaign. One particularly memorable was in Michigan, during the Michigan primary, when at the suggestion of Stan Greenberg, who was polling for the campaign, and Doug Ross, who was running the DLC in Michigan, the president went to a church, a predominantly African-American church in inner city Detroit, and gave a speech on opportunity and responsibility, and then delivered virtually the same speech the next day to an audience at Macomb County Community College. And Macomb, of course, was famous as kind of the, the wellspring of the Reagan Democrats, the blue-collar white Democrats who become disaffected from the party. That seemed very symbolic of what he was trying to do, to argue that there was kind of a common language, a message that could appeal equally on all sides of the racial divide. Talk about that, about trying to find a language to speak to whites and African Americans in the same terms.
Well, I had a 7-year bet with Jack Rosenthal, who was then head of the editorial page of the New York Times, that we would find a candidate and we could develop a message with the right candidate that would talk to working class whites and African Americans, like Bobby Kennedy. And I believe it was the day after the day of the Illinois primary where he, in an editorial, acknowledged that we had done just that, sort of conceded the bet to me. But Vernon made a really important point. Bill Clinton, Governor Clinton, always went to the people. What we did when he started as chairman of the DLC, the first thing we did was we laid out our philosophy, the New Orleans Declaration. And for historians, you ought to go to the speech he gave at Hyde Park in 2000 and see how every principle that we outlined led to policies, because he did a speech in Hyde Park where he showed everything that he did as president came from those principles. Something that is the kind of deep belief that I think is really important for the presidency. But the other thing we did is we went around and we were in 25 states. We weren't doing political fundraising. We weren't doing regular organizing. We were meeting with small groups of people, diverse groups of people, and talking about the ideas that came to define the campaign. So we had a very good feeling on how people would respond, and also they helped us shape those ideas. But one of the things that always struck me, in whether we were in California or Montana or South Dakota, or Wyoming, wherever we were, is President Clinton could go to two groups that were absolutely 180 degrees opposed on a single idea, something like charter schools, for example. He would give the same speech to both groups, word for word, and both of them would come out saying, I might not agree with everything, but this guy's on the right side of the issue.
Frank, go ahead.
I think one of the things is that Bill Clinton and I also grew up in the segregated South. And we understood, I think, it took someone from that experience to bridge the gap between working class whites and African Americans. And in the announcement speech, he talks about, I know what they want to do. They want us fighting each other, staring across the divide instead of turning our attention to the people who are responsible because we don't have jobs for blacks, for whites, for working people in this country. And that was what he wanted to do. He understood it because I think he had lived it. And how do you bring that coalition together? It was growing up in the segregated South.
That was very important, and to give credit where it's due to Bill Clinton and the work that he had done here. That was a motif that was bubbling up across the, quote, New South during that period among Democrats who had figured out in the aftermath of desegregation how they could get back in the game. because Republicans had taken over most of the state houses and many of the state legislatures. I grew up in North Carolina, and that's what we had seen. But it was Democrats who realized that there were these cross-cutting unifying issues like education, which were the right things to do also for their states, that understood that they could bring people together rather than to divide them.
Although in the long, we'll talk about this a little later, although in the long run, the coalition ended up being more minorities and upper middle class or college-educated whites than in fact minorities and blue-collar whites. It didn't really play out that way over time, but Lottie?
Yeah, as you talk about particularly African Americans, and one of the things that related so well because they could feel a genuineness. They knew that when Clinton talked to them, he was genuine. This was not someone who had gone and read a little script the night before and then tried to, you know, spill it out for them. They knew that. Then, you know, when Vernon talked about the Democratic Party and its leadership, I think we must recognize the fact that even the Democratic Party nationally was undergoing a change. Ron Brown had been elected in 1989, and that was a change occurring because Ron and Paul Tully, who was political director, had started that leadership off, and they were going across the country to Democrats who felt that there was just no hope, showing them how they could win. So I think you take that coupled with all of the Clintonites, as they called us, from the Arkansas Travelers to Carol Willis's Buffalo Group, and all of them who started in 1991, going across this country saying, you know, my governor may run for president. Will you take a look at it? And we went into all kinds of places doing that campaign. So I think it was a, you know, that was the first campaign, I think, on a national level that started to embrace all facets and gave value. And they gave value to all facets and to all groups because of Bill Clinton and because of what he said.
James, let me ask you though, I mean, even with the kind of the sharpening of this message and the success in the primary against Tsongas, by the time the primaries ended, you guys were pretty bruised and battered. I mean, there was routinely polling late spring, early summer that had Bill Clinton not only trailing President Bush, but also Ross Perot. I remember in our exit poll at the LA Times in California, among voters in the Democratic primary, Perot was running extraordinarily well in the general election. So talk about a little bit about where you ended up in the primary and the process that you went through to try to reintroduce Governor Clinton to the country, culminating in the convention speech.
Well, I just want to point one thing out. I'm the only person here that actually had to travel north to get to Little Rock.
While he's pointing it out.
Yeah, I don't know. I just like to point it out.
Yeah,
It makes me different. I like
but we need to go back to one thing because we want to.
It was just a joke.
Yeah, something has to be cleared up, and that is there was the impression that all Democrats who grew up in a segregated society got the message. That's not true.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That's true.
Bill Clinton got it, but there are a lot of them who did not get it and do not have it now.
All right. What happened is that I think it was people were saying in May of 1992 that there was some chance you had to reach a certain threshold to qualify for matching funds.
Right.
And there was actually talk that we would not reach that threshold. It was like 30% or something like that. And it was like serious talk. And there was a front page story in the New York Times, I'll never forget, a Johnny Apple story, saying that Democrats on the Hill were still looking for some alternative, although it looked like that Bill Clinton had the nomination. All of those things were going on in May of that year. Stan and I went in and said, look, we're going to get the nomination. Knew that Ron Brown had sent Paul Tully down here once it became to a mathematical certainty that we were going to get it because you have proportional delegation. And we started something, we actually refer to it as the Manhattan Project, where we went and did I don't know how many focus groups and everything. And what we found out is that people really saw that this was an extraordinary talented person, and once were able to connect the biography. That, you know, it was who is this guy? Who is this, you know, it sort of exploded onto the stage. He has all of these things to say that we kind of agree with. He's got this sort of, looks like a, you know, a lot of things swirling around there. Who is the real Bill Clinton? And then Harry and Mandy and all of those did Remember the Man from Hope, that the whole sort of thing connecting.
Well, go back a step though there. Wasn't one of the findings in these focus groups that people thought many people thought he was a child of privilege, right? I mean, he'd be kind of...
Yeah, they didn't know, but he was so kind of articulate that they assumed that he was, and they kind of knew that he went to elite schools and that kind of stuff.
And he was wealthy. And
Oxford.
we had to reintroduce who he was and what his values were. And because they thought he was a rich kid with a silver spoon in his mouth, and they resented that.
And obviously, as Lottie, as James was saying, that culminated in the convention speech, which really was rooted in the Arkansas experience. And the argument became that he would defend the middle class because he was a product of the middle class. I mean, that I thought was the kind of the core argument of the convention speech. But it was rooted in the Arkansas experience. I mean, that became the metaphor for how he ascended and how he would help others ascend.
But he also very clearly went back to sort of the New Democrat reforms. I mean, you know, when you have a primary in a state like New York, you get, it sort of defines you as opposed to you defining it.
And he literally and figuratively may have lost his voice in New York, as I recall.
But just a couple of things that I thought were really important in that period, and there were a lot of others. But one is, you know, when he picked his vice presidential candidate, he really broke a paradigm. He didn't balance the ticket. He made it clear it was a message campaign. I mean, one of the things that we can't lose as we think about all the things that happen in a campaign is how message-oriented this campaign was. We were telling people we're different. And, you know, by picking Al Gore to be vice president, I remember when he called me and said it was going to be the changing of the guard. But it was part of the message that we were trying to deliver. He went to a labor organization and did a speech on reinventing government. You know, in the platform, we didn't do what every other Democratic candidate had always done, which is give the platform to the losers. We ran on the new covenant, opportunity, responsibility, and community. We made that the platform. We had to fight off a lot of amendments by others in the party, but we were determined to run on our own platform. We did a whole bunch of things during that period which drove the Perot vote down because it made clear that Clinton was not the same kind of Democrat people have been voting against.
In addition to that, a lot of people tend to forget, but on November 3rd, 1992, all these folk, I was there, and we were going like, oh, you were? But because people tend to forget that when the Clinton campaign started, most of the movers and shakers, so to speak, didn't want to have anything to do, which meant in practically every state, as James talked about, raising the required monies and what have you, in practically every state, it was true grassroots at that time. These were not the movers and shakers on the political scene in these communities. These were everyday people who believed in him and believed in his message and really got out there. And that went on. And I think that was one of the turning points. If we want to talk about something that goes further than that campaign and that time, that was one of the true meaning of grassroots. And the Clintons had the ability to empower folks. I mean, people were out there doing things that you never knew they were doing, but they were doing it because there was this sense of empowerment they had from the campaign. Folk, then once Clinton moved forward from the primary, everybody just knew, oh, that campaign will not stay in Arkansas, not during a general. And when he said it would stay in Arkansas, two things. Number one, nobody got fired, they just kept hiring folks. And so, so we had more layers in that campaign than any campaign I'd ever known. But it meant that more people were empowered. a lot of good people who were sorry later didn't come to work on that campaign because they didn't want to move to Little Rock. Right. Little Rock, Arkansas.
James, let me ask you as you start moving toward the general election. We talked a lot about message and agenda, but that wasn't the whole story. In many ways, some of the most distinctive marks of this campaign were in some of the innovations that you pursued in tactics and things that have now become commonplace, like a war room or using pop culture channels. I know Mandy was very involved in that. When he went on Arsenio Hall, there was a great debate about whether that was somehow demeaning for a presidential candidate. Even doing a town hall meeting on a morning show seemed a kind of a big step forward. Talk a little bit about, and of course, at the absolute cutting edge of 20th century technology, the blast fax, which was practically like running for president with the Jetsons as you're running there. So talk a little bit about that side of. Did you feel like you had to try new things to kind of?
That was the time when the cell phone was bigger than Stan Greenberg. One thing that you have to go back and understand is the searing impression that the '88 Dukakis campaign made on the Democratic Party. You just cannot imagine that it was so a lot of things were, to some extent, governed by that. And some
no
of it
tanks,
was,
for example.
Right.
No tanks.
So, and if you go back and to sort of cultural things that happened, from Arsenio Hall to sort of morning shows that people do that. I mean, how many war rooms have there been since 1992? Everybody has a war room now. I mean, companies have war rooms. Everybody's got a war room.
People have built in their house.
Have built in their house. And actually, believe it or not, as pointed out in the book, it was actually Hillary who came up with the sort of term when we went and sort of looked, this is what we kind of want to do. She said, yeah, that's what we need. Look, let's have like a war room. It's great. So pick that. How many times, if you Google, it's the blank stupid, would you get? Millions. You look at the bus tour. To sort of become, see, President Obama, President Obama went on a bus tour. Bus tours have sort of become sort of part of the culture. I mean, the sort of change of all of that. And I think the one, if I look back, the one thing where you sort of knew it was going to work, and when the Gore thing, when they came to Little Rock and there was a visual at the governor's mansion, and back at the governor's mansion, you knew right as soon as you saw that, you kind of knew.
Was that with the families and the
right?
Yeah.
You just can't imagine that the visual that kind of had that there was a kind of a new guard here, and you're just sitting there, and you kind of everybody knew it. It was, but again, a lot of the things that we did were also, and it seems so odd, but that news cycles had just become so compressed. And that so often, we find it's the first take is the take that really, everybody would kind of wait for, somebody to write a column or put an interpretation on a debate, and then they would kind of, and you had that, and then we had an unbelievable, as you and I were talking, if you go back and you look at the press corps that we had traveling, that was back when the press had money.
Yeah.
But I mean, some of the most aggressive, talented people in journalism were sort of covering that every kind of day in and day out, and it was pretty amazing. It was a pretty amazing time. So, but I do think that if you look at it, I think that the campaign was not just a different way, but it was a sort of cultural transformation of American politics.
We mentioned the Dukakis campaign. Certainly in the general election, the Bush campaign reprised many of the arguments that had worked very effectively against Democrats over the previous 24 years. Tax and spend liberal, kind of weak on foreign policy, and yet, partially because there was, there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the status quo. They did not prove as effective. What was different, do you think, ultimately? Did the New Democrat positioning give him a stronger kind of line of defense, or why did those arguments not work as well as they had, for example, in '88?
Well, first, the new Democrat positioning, in my view, gave him not just a great defense, it gave him an offense. It gave him a sort of forward lean, and that's what I mean by the ideas that were out there. They were actually leading the pack. I think the other thing we all have to remember, we were in a completely new context and landscape for that election. It was the first presidential election after the end of the Cold War. And many new ideas people were open to, new perspectives. It was a new opportunity to kind of lift up our heads and think about national leadership in a whole different way, and finally to sort of step up and solve a lot of the things that we have been facing all these years that actually have been stuffed aside because of the larger national security considerations. You know, one of the things, I want to come back to this race situation or issue. In the course of the 8 years of the Clinton presidency, and started very much in this campaign, Bill Clinton systematically, nothing ever seemed quite systematic, but systematically took off the table the wedge issues that Republicans and conservatives had used to divide the country and to divide progressive forces for the 25 or 30 years before that. Welfare reform, crime, any number of other things. And to the point that, not to sound Pollyannish about it, but race was no longer the driving force in American politics that it had been, really, for most of the previous half century.
You anticipate one of my last questions because... Go ahead, James.
Part of the narrative against then Governor Clinton was his whole life was plotting and scheming to advance himself in politics. So in order to run for governor of Arkansas, he had two signature issues: opposition to the Vietnam War and a very aggressive sort of pro-civil rights thing, because that was really the way that you got elected governor of Arkansas in the 70s. You say that was what, that was the thing that you did. So if you were going to sort of craft and craft your political career, those would be the two things that you would pick. I mean, it was sort of beneficial. There was some excellent sort of political consulting back then.
Yeah. Vernon, Jordan, can I start with you? I'm interested, we talked about how in the spring there was a low ebb, but I'm interested in kind of your thought of was there a moment when you thought, wow, this really could happen? I mean, this campaign really could elect the president.
Well, you won't believe this because it will sound a little bit self-serving. I came to Little Rock in 1973. to speak to the Little Rock Urban League. The president and Hillary came to that dinner. It was the first time I met him. I went back home and told my then wife, Shirley, that I had just met a president of the United States. I knew it, and I was right. And what I liked about him is that he left law school and came home. I left law school and came home. He came back to the South to do something about race. I went back to Atlanta to do something about race. And we made that connection in 1973, and we've been connected ever since, Mr. President.
Anybody else? 1992. What was the moment, Al, in 1992 that you thought this could work?
I thought, I mean, my moment was before 1992. I did a celebrity outward bond deal in the fall, in September of 1991, which was right before the announcement, with Arthur Sulzberger, who was about ready to take over the New York Times, and I told him the next president of the United States is going to be Bill Clinton. I was convinced when we went around the country in 1990 and 1991 that this man was going to be president, you know, I had a few doubts as the numbers went down a little bit in May, but I really, I thought he was going to be president, you know, in 1990 and 1991.
I will say, and I remember the event in, I think it was San Francisco, where I first saw you and Hillary both speak at a Children's Defense Fund dinner, and I came up and introduced myself. I said, this guy, this couple, but these folks really have a message, and they really know how to communicate. And that was the key difference. They had this core values and core beliefs, and I really believed from that point on, and especially in his gubernatorial campaign that I worked on. I mean, it was clear that this, more than any other Democrat, this was somebody who understood how to connect with people, By the way, Vernon, the thing about Take Me to the People, the key turning point many times when we were in trouble was doing town meetings, getting away from the press corps that were beating the hell out of us and going and saying, let's talk to real people. And those real people gave you strength, but also it gave, it said this is what the message is about.
Don, you want to ask me?
Yeah, so, and I'm going to sound like I'm mimicking Vernon, but given that it's Vernon, I don't mind being thought of as mimicking him. So I described when I knew that he would be president, and it was that trip that I took with him in early September 1991. We had this long period of time. We landed. He and Hillary went off back here to Chelsea's dance. I flew back to Washington that night, and Washington on a Friday night being the way it was then and still is now, I went to a dinner party in Georgetown that had some journalists at it, very, very cynical kinds of people, and actually a guy who worked on the White House staff of the Bush administration, and my wife was there, and I walked in, and I said to my wife and the people there, I said, I am absolutely certain that I just spent the day with the next president of the United States. Now this was when Bush was, I don't know, at 60% in the polls. And my wife was nice to me, and everyone else in the room, Washington being Washington, said, you're out of your mind. But it was so absolutely clear, and it did relate very much to something Vernon touched on. This was somebody who had shown, by virtue of where he invested his life, that he was committed to people and had come home. I was a Southerner, too, had gone to law school out of the South, or up north, and didn't go home to work on race and those things. I became a media lawyer in New York and then went on to be a journalist. And I so respected that I knew what he had given up to come back to do what he felt was the most important thing in the world, that I thought it would definitely pierce through.
One short thing, though, I was going to say, he really also was a national leader. We make him out to be this wonderful leader for Arkansas, and he was. But I also remember his performance at National Governors Association meeting, at the Education Summit in Charlottesville, where Bush called the Education Summit, and Clinton literally captured that education reform movement.
James, let me ask you, because I mean, before the, I mean, everybody's saying, they saw this, they could feel it. There was another speed bump in the fall. Ross Perot comes back in the race, gets in a surprising audience, in the, seemingly had disqualified himself in the summer, comes back in the debates, and all of a sudden you're looking at a race that I think at one point was 3-4 points, again 5 as Perot went up, right? Talk about a little bit about that and what your interpretation was of why Perot found an audience and what it meant for you in those final weeks.
First of all, a lot of the senior people in that campaign were either Catholics or Jews. And that's one thing Catholics and Jews share in common. We ain't optimistic about much. We always think the worst thing is going to happen, And I wasn't, election morning, I could, Stan and I'd meet, 6:30 and get to, go over where it was. I don't think we ever showed it tightening like some of the national. And Gallup had it, like but they changed the asking. But it was, I just wouldn't allow myself to kind of think of it. And you never knew what was going to happen, and you just don't. Sure that I guess deep down inside, but I wouldn't even allow myself to think about something like that. It just is not the sort of nature that was going to happen. But I do think, looking back on it, the convention is when the thing kind of broke, and I think there's a real reason behind that. Is I think people wanted to be for him. They saw something sort of talented. They saw something there, and once that you were able to connect that who he was with what he was saying, I think that was the thing that, looking back, that probably pushed him.
The agenda and the biography fusing.
Yeah, I just want to add one little aspect of this. Consistent with what I believed about Bill Clinton. In 1991, I took Bill Clinton to the Bilderberg meetings in Baden-Baden, Germany. The Bilderberg meeting has been going on since 1954, sort of the North American-European alliance. And the two other U.S. politicians there were Governor Doug Wilder and Senator Dianne Feinstein. They were sort of laid back. The governor of Arkansas cornered every person at that meeting. What do you do? Where are you from? And how do you do it? And so they would come to me and say, who is this Clinton guy? And where is Arkansas? These are Europeans. And I said to the Europeans, I said, he's going to be the next president of the United States. And they said, that's impossible. Bush has 90% approval rating. He's a Republican, and they were all for Bush. Well, he won. And the steering committee of Bilderberg came to Washington in January. And I called the president up and I said, Mr. President, they're here. And he came to the Four Seasons Hotel, and the Europeans felt like they owned him because they met him when he was totally unknown.
And they gave him advice.
Yeah. Our time is basically, I think we've basically consumed all our time. I want to ask one final thing, and think about kind of the lasting impact of this campaign and this agenda and this coalition. As we mentioned, Republicans have won 5 of the 6 elections, presidential elections from 1968 to 1988. Since 1992, Democrats have now won the popular vote, at least, in 4 of the past 5 elections. On the other hand, some of the problems that were there when Bill Clinton arrived are still there. No Democrat has won more than 43% of the vote among whites over that period, and in 2010, the Democratic vote among whites ran down to the lowest level ever in congressional election in the history of polling. We do, after a 90s period in which politics seemed to be deracialized, we have enormous gaps now in the difference between the way whites and non-whites vote. So, Al, if you kind of look at the whole ledger, what was the lasting impact of this agenda and message in reshaping the Democratic coalition, and has it evolved since President Clinton's time?
Well, everything evolves, but I mean, there are so many lasting impacts. Vernon was talking about the European leaders. During the 1980s, in almost every European country, there were conservative governments, starting with Tony Blair and New Labour. This formula that really Bill Clinton developed changed the whole face of world politics. I think there are some things, probably some of the political things, where there may have been some backsliding in the party and where the party has to work its way through it again. But I think there are a lot of other things that are really very important. Nobody questions a lot of the ideas that got us, that caused us so much grief. I don't see people wanting to repeal welfare reform, the whole idea of AmeriCorps and national service. We changed the whole policing system in the country with community policing and 100,000 cops. Charter schools is the central element of President Obama's reform agenda for education. And I think most importantly, I do think that at least, you know, there are always some backsliders in any political party, because we're a coalition party. We're not like the Republicans, you know, everybody's exactly the same. You know, the understanding that if we're going to be a successful party, you've got to grow the private economy so you create jobs for ordinary people. I don't think that's, our party has lost that either. And, you know, that may seem like a simple thing, but it wasn't a simple thing in 1991.
I don't know if anyone desperately wants to add anything, but that seems like a good final summary on which to stop. So thank you all for listening. And I think the President would like to make a few final remarks.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank the panelists. I thought they were great. And thank you for taking me down memory lane. Not everything they said is true. The truth is, the day I declared for president, my mother was the only person in America who thought I could win. Hillary and Chelsea were undecided, leaning maybe. And so were they. That's not quite true. But there's a couple of points I want to make based on what they said. First of all, we couldn't win the election in New Hampshire, but we could have lost it. And New Hampshire worked for me because it was enough like here. I mean, ask Patty Kreiner, who moved up there, and so many of our other, Sheila Brump and the Arkansas Travelers, they were great. And I just want to say, since we're here in Little Rock, it would be a big mistake to, here's what the deal was. The Republicans thought that I was the only person who had a theoretical chance to win, even though when I started running, I was 5th in the polls. So they knew they couldn't whip me on the issue, so they decided to go after me. That's what that whole draft deal was about. And so I went up to 35, and I got down to 18, and I was heading down to single digits. And Greenberg said, you know, unless somebody's got a pretty strong foot to put on the brake, we're going to single digits. And 18 wasn't enough. Hundreds of people came from Arkansas spontaneously. I mean, literally, it was like almost not organized. My friend David Leopoulos told his employer he had to go, and he couldn't afford to fly, so he drove straight through and started going around a radio station saying, hey, you got to let me talk about this. You can't do this to that guy. 600 people from Arkansas took out a full-page ad in the Manchester Union Leader with their phone numbers and said, call us, collect. Don't believe what they're telling you about our governor. We will tell you we know him. And New Hampshire takes this seriously. Thousands and thousands of people call these people in Arkansas collect. And they're tight. They call them collect. And then with our volunteers that were already there, James remembers this, and the Arkansas people that drove up, we bagged 100,000 1992 equivalent of DVDs. I guess they were Betamaxes or something. Little films. You remember that? And, yeah, VHS, whatever. And we put 100,000 of them on the doors of the voters we identified as still persuadable. So it would, and we came back and said we stopped going down at some point, somewhere below 18%, and we got back to 26% or 27%, whatever we got, and the rest is history. So that's the first thing I want to say. I'm very grateful to the people of this state. The second thing is, having a narrative is really important. And if one side does and the other side doesn't, it's a very bad deal. So the one thing that people like me who are real oriented toward policy need to guard against is losing the forest for the trees. And one of the things that really helped us was that we not only had a narrative from the beginning, we had a theme song. Remember that? This man right here is responsible for it. Stand up. Now look, it's the truth. So I want a little known factoid in American history. This is Sean Landry's, and when he was an infant, practically, I flew to California to give a speech, not particularly political, and he said, I think you're going to run for president next year, and I hope you do, and if you do, this should be your theme song. This guy's driving me a lot. I never met him before. He's like 12 years old. It's a true story. And so, and there were no CDs then, so you had a tape. We had those tape decks. So he puts this song in the tape deck, and it's Fleetwood Mac singing Don't Stop Thinking About Tomorrow. And I looked at him and I said, you weren't born when that was made. Actually, yeah, he was 2 years old. He's it. So I just want you to, it's a fluky deal. And the minute I listened to it for 30 seconds, and I knew he was right. So if you were part of that campaign, you should thank him. He had a lot to do with it. He was. Now, you all talked about race, and that brings me to, I want to come back to the narrative, but one of the things that always mystified me, every time I look back at something I'd said in 1974 or 1976, is how all the media said I didn't believe anything, and I was slick. What they really said is, how dare you not talk like all the people in Washington? And how dare you expect us to have to look at your record in piddly little old Arkansas as a governor to see whether or not you're serious about this. We know how we want to talk about politics. A conservative is somebody who despises government, hates taxes, hates regulation, thinks all programs would mess up a two-car parade. And a liberal is anybody that disagrees. You are confusing us. Therefore, you have no convictions, no soul, no conscience, no nothing. And it didn't work, and especially didn't work with African Americans who have a very good detector, the adjective for which we cannot use on C-SPAN. Any group of people that's ever been worked over has got a good, they can tell if you're for them or not. It's not rocket science. And I did meet Vernon in 1973, by which time he'd already been friends with Hillary for 4 years. Something he never stopped telling me. And in 1977, I became Attorney General. I had by then taught in the law school at the University of Arkansas 3/4 of all the African American lawyers then practicing in the state. 20% of my professional staff was African American, 25% were female lawyers. Now over half the law students in America are women. That wasn't the case then. I had one of the highest percentages of women lawyers of any Attorney General's office in America, and the highest percentage of African American lawyers. And when they went after me in the boardrooms of the elite liberal newspapers, I told them, I said, 15 years ago, when I was a hick Attorney General in the state that you continue to diss, I had a higher percentage of African American professionals in my office than you do today. So when you catch up to me, then you come back to see me and tell me how I don't believe in nothing. Meanwhile, I think I'll go back to work. So, but the media then was coming to grips with the problem that they have now. Their problem. This is not a criticism. I'm expressing empathy with them. It is tough running these TV shows today, and it's tough. The economics of newspapers are horrible. They're horrible. The economics of magazines are horrible. And so that's why you see these blurrings of news and commentary and entertainment. And if you're like me and you're semi-retired, you don't ever have to watch the news at all if you don't want to. You can just change the channel and watch a movie or sports or something. So this is difficult, and that's why they look for shorthand boxes to put people in. When President Kennedy was in office, the average president, when he was on the evening news, talked for, I think, 30 seconds or something, maybe 40. And now it's down to 6 or 8. I mean, this is a generalized problem. But anyway, I want to thank everybody, starting with Al and the people who are here in Arkansas, Rodney Slater, who started with me in 1982 and wrote it all the way to the cabinet, and richly deserved, I might add. Ron Brown, in his heart of hearts, was really a New Democrat, even though he's never with us. And not a week goes by I don't think about him and thank God for his presence in my life. He was a wonderful man. I loved him. So, second thing I want to, but this idea of having ideas, that's the other thing I was going to say. 2008 was the first time since 1992, I think because people were hurting so bad, that they were starved for ideas. But I put out this little booklet, and people were making fun of me, saying it's too detailed, it's too policy wonky. And the only other person who had his own little booklet that was just as detailed and policy wonky as mine was Paul Tsongas. He's the guy that beat me in New Hampshire. We got 60% of the vote in a 6-person field because we were the only person that said, here is what we're going to do. I remember we were driving up to Claremont one night, no, to Keene, and I said, how many people we got to have? The New Hampshire person that was with me. What do we have to have here to avoid humiliation? We just put up little, it was very primitive, little bulletins, flyers. He said 50. I said, what's a grand success? He said 150. I'd never been to Keene before. We show up, there's 400 people there. The fire marshal won't let them come in the door. Why? Just because I said what we were going to do. It's very important for people to remember that when they hire you to be president, people understand it's a job and they want to know what the heck you're going to do. And Paul Tsongas had a very detailed plan that was what he wanted to do. And it didn't hurt anything that he was from a town 5 miles from the New Hampshire border. And then they made fun of us saying that after we did all the Comeback Kid stuff that we were second, you know. And I said, that's right. Let's see how he does in Memphis, where 81% of the people voted for me. But I like Tsongas because he said what he was for. That's important. It's important not to forget. But I will say all this to the rest of you. It's very important not to get caught in all this labeling. It really is important to take it back to the people and always make it about the people and make every campaign about the circumstances of the time. I go crazy every time I read the conventional wisdom, which the Republican narrative, they're so much better at narrative than we are. I mean, give it to them. They are. Of course, it's easier to have a narrative if, you know, the story is always the same. Government's evil, taxes are bad, you know, that kind of stuff. But still, give it to them. They're good at it. So part of the Republican narrative is that I was saved from myself by the election of the Republican Congress that forced me to do welfare reform and made the balanced budget possible. And a lot of these folks in Ron's profession keep saying this, overlooking all relevant facts. Fact number one, the budget was 90% balanced before the Balanced Budget Act was passed. So it isn't true that the Democrats, and only Democrats voted for the 93 budget. It isn't true that they don't want to balance the budget. They toted the load. Fact number two, when it comes to welfare reform, the first New Democrat was Bobby Kennedy. And if he hadn't been killed, the whole world would have known it. The second New Democrat on welfare reform was Jimmy Carter, who gave 4 or 5 states the right to start welfare reform experiments. And I called the White House, and because I'd worked in the Carter campaign when I was governor, I begged them to make Arkansas one of the test cases, and they gave it to us. Fact number 3, before the welfare reform bill passed, Donna Shalala and I had given 43 of the 50 states waivers to implement welfare reform before we ever had a bill. And yet I kept reading how this was a Republican idea. Just because President Reagan had a good story about a welfare queen in a Cadillac who didn't exist. And so I'm telling you all this, I want you to laugh, but it's kind of sad. I'm telling you this to point out we need a coherent narrative. And we need the reason, and it's the only thing I'm going to say about the current circumstances. I thought the President did the right thing to lay out a coherent plan to jumpstart the economy now and try to get the growth rate higher. I thought he did the right thing to tell the American people the truth. We are never going to balance the budget at this rate of economic growth, with this rate of low job formation and this rate of low new business investment. You have to have spending cuts, new revenues, and economic growth. That's why we had, actually, my last budget was also a surplus budget. 4 of our 8 budgets were surplus budgets, but it's because they sparked a lot of growth. So you got to have all 3 things. And I think it's really important for those of us, when we look back at that time, to remember what they said. The economy wasn't as bad then as it is now, but it was pretty bad. And we kept slipping back in. We'd get out of the recession, we'd slip back in, and we weren't generating job growth. And a lot of people were really hurting, and we went to see a bunch of them. You remember that. And the number one rule of effective politics, especially if the people you're running against have a simple narrative. The government is always the problem. There is no such thing as a good tax or a bad tax cut. There's no such thing as a good program or a bad program cut. No such thing as a good regulation or a bad deregulation. If you're going to fight that, your counter has to be rooted in the lives of other people. And so they made that happen. The other thing I want to say, I'd be remiss if I didn't do this. I have deep gratitude for every one of these people, but I got to tell you, we were looking at total meltdown about a week before New Hampshire, and we're in a little room. And James Carville events the kind of, you know, he likes to act crazy because it helps him get speaking gigs. He figures if he goes around acting like he needs, you know, a rabies shot, that more and more people will want to see him. But we were alone. You remember that? Just a handful of us in that little old motel room. And they were saying I was dead, and all the commentators saying I should withdraw. And James Carville stood up and he said, I served in the United States Marines. I come from Louisiana. I like people who believe in serving this country and combat. He said, unlike all these people that are saying Bill Clinton is dead, I have actually read his letter. And I believe we should take a full-page ad out in the Manchester Union Leader and print his Vietnam letter. It made me think more of him. He said, don't let people define this. This is a kid. He was a kid. He said some things that he'd say different today, but he loved his country and he had a good reason to do it. And he said, if I served in the Marine Corps, I feel that way, then we can still win this thing. Now, everybody get up and go back to work. He deserves a lot of credit for that. He stood alone in that room and said that. So, that's my thing. We always need a narrative. It needs to be people-centered. We need specifics so people know what we're going to do. And we need to understand that one of the things that tends to tilt things toward the Republicans' anti-government narrative is our country was born out of a suspicion of government. King George's government was not accountable to us. That's what the Boston Tea Party was about. When the Tea Party started out, at least they were against unaccountable behavior from top to bottom. Then it morphed into something different. If you want to go against that grain, you got to tell people you understand it's a privilege and a responsibility to spend their tax money, but there's some things we have to do together. And that's what the purpose of government is, to do the things we have to do together that we can't do on our own. So that believing in shared prosperity and shared responsibility and sharing our membership in the community is better than you're on your own. And if we can make that choice credible, then our candidates, starting with the president, and our principles will be fine. And we also have to always realize that we might be wrong about something. That also is a good thing. Because if one group, once you show your own strength, says I might be wrong about a particular thing, and the other group never does, the average person thinks more of the honest side than the proud side, the falsely proud side. I don't think any of that's changed very much. And I was touched when Frank Greer said he read the DLC speech and the announcement speech, and a lot of it was relevant today. So again, I thank all these people for what they did all those long years ago. I thank all of you who are part of it. I thank the people of Arkansas, without whom I probably wouldn't have survived in New Hampshire. I want to thank Ron Brownstein. I'm afraid it'll cost him half of his new gigs. But when he criticized me, I read it seriously because I considered him to be a righteously honest person who had convictions about the way the world worked, about the way the world it should work, and looked not at what you said through a preconceived smokescreen, but looked at what you said and what you did. That's all anybody should ever want from the press. Remember, Benjamin Franklin once said, our adversaries can be our friends, for they show us our faults. He always played it straight, and I'm honored by his presence here today. So thank you all. It was great. Thank you.